Hey everyone, welcome to Judging for the Win. I'm Dave, and this is my daily ruling. Today I'm going to be trying something a little bit different. If you've watched my channels for a while, you've probably heard me use the term regular or competitive REL. However, if you're not a judge, as a lot of my audience isn't, then I certainly wouldn't expect you to know a priori what these terms mean. I've also had some requests for longer form content, so I thought this would be a good fit for that. Today I'm going to be going into detail about exactly what the difference between regular and competitive REL is. I've split things up into three different categories, so to speak. The first are the really big differences, the things that came to mind immediately when I first started thinking about this question. The next set is some kind of specific stuff that only applies in special cases, and finally there's some ones that I don't really consider that big of a difference at all, mainly because in most cases where I live, in the tournaments that I'm familiar with, they're actually handled exactly the same way, even though they hypothetically could be different. So, let's take a look. The first big difference is the one that I tell people whenever they ask me why there's different RELs, or rules enforcement levels, in the first place. I ask, would you go to an FNM that did deck checks? Or would you go to a Grand Prix that didn't do deck checks? See, Magic is such a great game because it appeals to people over a wide range of attitudes about the competitive aspect of things. And it certainly is the case that there's a lot of problems in Magic communities that can be traced back to everybody not being on the same page about whether we're playing for fun or whether we're trying to beat other people at a children's card game. So, as a result, the rules enforcement level is a first step towards trying to get people on the same page as far as this topic goes. And, as I alluded to, one of the differences is that at regular REL, you don't have to use deck lists. At competitive REL, this is actually required. If you're mostly a regular REL player, you should know that if you go to a competitive rules enforcement event, you're going to have to write down every card that you are playing in your main deck and sideboard and turn that deck list in before the event starts. Something else that you might not have known is that it's actually possible for the head judge to require deck lists even at regular REL. This sort of thing does come up from time to time, and I've seen it happen, for example, at regular REL events that had significant prize pools, or at pre-releases where there was a concern about people sneaking in cards that they had already opened in a previous event earlier that day. The next big example is the difference between derived information and free information. Now, if you're wondering what the difference is, at regular REL, there isn't any, because all derived information is instead considered free. Now, at competitive REL, we have to get a little bit more technical. So, there's different types of things in Magic that you're allowed to lie or bluff about, and whether such a untruth, partial truth, or incomplete truth is acceptable or not is based on what category of information you're talking about. Some things, such as the player's life total or what objects are on the stack, are so fundamentally important to the functioning of the game that it's not permissible for a player to lie about them or make any incomplete or misleading statements about them at all. Other information is important to the game and the game state, but determining that information might require some act of skill or counting on behalf of the player. Think about the number of cards in your hand, or how many lands you have untapped. That information is considered derived information because it can be derived from the current game state. However, it's not up to either player to help their opponent out in doing so. That means that at competitive REL, it's legal for you to refuse to answer such a question and have your opponent do it themselves. However, you can't impede their ability to do so. At regular REL, because all derived information is considered free, you have to honestly answer questions like, how many cards do you have, or how much mana do you have untapped? Because that information is not derived anymore. At regular REL, it's free. That means that judges can also help players if they ask questions about derived information to help them understand the game state. Another one that you may have heard of is that competitive REL, you're not supposed to use dice or any other method that's easily changeable in order to keep track of your life total or poison counters. I said you're not supposed to rather than you can't because even though there's a specific rule that says you're not supposed to do it, there isn't really a penalty if you break this rule. Usually the judge or your opponent will just politely ask you to do so. If that's the case, you still do have to go with what the rules say, but you won't be getting a warning. That's another difference between competitive and regular REL. There's no official penalties for a lot of the stuff that happens in regular REL. You just get cautioned to play more carefully next time, and we don't give out game losses or anything significant unless a player is a repeat offender and their behavior is becoming disruptive to other players. Contrast this with competitive REL, where almost every single mistake a player makes in a game will be accompanied by a written warning, and if a player accumulates too many of these, then the penalty can even be upgraded to a game loss or something more severe. This doesn't mean that judges and players should be taking cheating any less seriously at regular REL. Rather, the focus is on entertainment and education rather than on trying to make sure everyone plays exactly properly at all times. Again, because we expect people playing at competitive REL to be playing a little bit more competitively. Finally, a big difference, especially for people like me, is that at regular REL, you're allowed to judge and play in the event at the same time. I'm a big fan of F&M, and I love playing every week, so this is something that makes my life a lot easier since I don't have to choose between one or the other. It's really nice, especially if you live in an area where multiple judges go to the same store, because you don't need to worry about a judge ruling in their own favor during a match if you can always ask a second judge's opinion. In cases where you're the only judge, or where there's a lot of rules questions happening because there's a lot of players, I also have a video that talks about this topic in detail and gives you some guidance about the appropriate way to handle such stuff. If you're a scorekeeper, the same rules apply. Now we'll move on to some stuff that's a little bit more specialized. I wouldn't say corner case because it definitely does come up, but there are a couple of specific cases that are handled differently, and it makes sense to consider all those differences together. The first is in electronic device usage. In competitive REL, you basically can only use your phone if you have some sort of really pressing emergency type of call that you have to attend to. In regular REL, you can use your phone or any other electronic device during a match for stuff that you would normally have to use a notebook for in competitive REL, such as players' life totals or looking at notes. The other area where there's a few differences is in drafting. So in regular REL, you can table talk during the draft because it's a more laid-back atmosphere, as long as you're not talking about strategic information. It's also legal for you to look at the cards that you've drafted, even in between picks. At competitive REL, you're only allowed to do this during the designated time that follows the end of every pack that you draft. Another difference relates to how players are paired against each other. If you do a draft at competitive REL, you're only allowed to be paired against players who are in the same draft pod as you. In regular REL, this is not the case, and the judge or scorekeeper can instead choose to pair people cross-pod, that is, against people who drafted in different pods. That'll help everybody in the store feel like they're playing in part of the same tournament. And finally, limited tournaments in general have something called continuous construction. In any limited event where players are not required to submit a deck list, it's legal for players to change their deck around in between rounds. So if you decide that some card that you put in your main deck isn't really doing it for you, you can swap it out for another card that's from your sideboard, and then play that instead in the first game of your next round. Finally, here are some other types of differences. As I said, where I play Magic, and in the tournaments that I'm familiar with, these don't generally end up being different in between regular and competitive REL, even though they hypothetically could be. One thing that you may have heard about is the ability to age restrict tournaments. Actually, you're only allowed to age restrict regular REL events. This allows, for example, a store to have an F&M for only players 16 and under, or for a store to have a tournament at a venue where alcoholic beverages are served, and therefore only people aged 21 and up would be able to attend. For my international viewers, yes, 21 is what age you have to be to drink alcohol in the United States. Another thing that I've heard is different for people in different areas of the world is that players are required to shuffle their opponent's deck at competitive REL. Where I live, in the Midwestern United States, that's not really a thing that you see people commonly do at any rules enforcement level. Generally, I expect people to just cut, and if both players are okay with that, which they almost always are, then that's fine with me. Sleeves are also subject to more scrutiny at competitive REL, especially sleeves that have holographic designs or reflective finishes on them. Such sleeves could potentially be used to allow a dishonest player to see the face of a card that they're not supposed to be able to see in the reflection. And that's the reason why sleeves with holographic or reflective elements on them are very rare to see, especially from the bigger manufacturers of card sleeves. The last difference that I wanted to talk about is the game layout. You may remember a few years ago, Wizards introduced an official layout. So for example, you couldn't have lands farther away from you than your creatures and other permanents. You had to have your graveyard, exile zone, and library all either on the left or all on the right, and some other stuff about how your general card layout would have to be. Pretty much everybody I know follows the standard layout anyway, so it's not really a big issue. However, it hypothetically could be. Again, this is the sort of thing that you aren't really going to get a penalty for if you try to do it differently, but your opponent could ask you to do it the way that they're used to, and you would have to honor that request if they did. And that's all I have for you today. How did you like this new content type? Should I do more longer form videos like this in the future? How many of these rules did you know about? And especially, if you're one of my international fans, tell me if there's anything that I talked about which wasn't a big difference for me, but is a big difference in the area of the world where you live. I'm really interested to hear how other cultures handle the same game. But that's all I have for today. Join me again tomorrow for another daily ruling, but until then, I hope you have a great day.